This video may be disturbing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hey guys! What's up? Alpha Lion Simba here, and welcome to another countdown video. Now, anybody who's familiar with me off YouTube or on YouTube knows that I love zoos. I jump at any chance at going to a zoo. In fact, I've been to quite a few in and outside of Ohio. But, alas, much like with theme parks, no zoo is perfect. Like a theme park, zoos are going to have their fair share of horrible accidents, be they animal escapes or attacks. So, I'm going to be counting down the top 10 worst zoo incidents. So, with no further ado, let's begin.
Number 10. Louie the Elephant attacks his trainer at the Toledo Zoo. Now, Louie is a 14-year-old male African elephant who was born at the Toledo Zoo. In fact, I actually remember seeing Louie when he was still just a calf. However, as everybody knows, the most serious and frequent injuries to zookeepers were caused by elephants, particularly males such as Louie. Such an incident occurred in 2010. One victim of such attack was a man by the name of Don Rexford, who at the time was the zoo's elephant manager, and he had worked with Louie since he was a calf. The attack happened on July 1st, 2010, just before 4 p.m. Rexford went inside the elephant house to do his work when he violated one of the biggest safety rules regarding captive elephants. He went inside alone. Shortly after Rexford entered the building, Louie charged at him. Rexford said that the elephant hit him with his tusk, injuring his ribs, wrists, and eyes. He could not see and was having trouble breathing. Rexford was badly injured, but thankfully he was saved by an off-duty police officer who was at the zoo at the time with his son. Experts at the zoo still don't know why Louie attacked. Some speculated that Louie was just play fighting because he backed away several times during the incident. I personally had this theory that since Louie was an adolescent at the time, at least in elephant years, he was probably undergoing must since he was 7 years old at the time of the attack. However, I learned that bull elephants usually don't go into must until they're 8 years old. But even at the time, since he was a teen, Louie was still having some rambunctious behavior, hence why he was often separated from his mother, Renee. Thankfully, though, Louie is still doing okay, and right now, he resides at the North Carolina Zoo. This incident proves that while they can be really good zoo animals, elephants, particularly bulls, can be very unpredictable, and great care must be taken. Number 9. Vijay the white tiger at the Delhi Zoo in New Delhi, India. Now, this is going to be the first non-American zoo on this list, but still, the incident is kind of crazy. The casualty was not an employee, but a visitor. A 21-year-old man named Maksud, who was suffering from mental illness and drug-related problems. He had an intense fascination with the zoo's tigers, and he claimed to his mother that he'd go out looking for a job, when in reality, he was just headed to the zoo to take a look at the tigers. Then one day, when he wasn't thinking in his right mind, Macaque jumped into the tiger enclosure where Vijay, an adult male white tiger, was standing. At first, Vijay was just curious about something new in his environment, hence why he and Macaque just stood face to face with each other for several minutes. However, onlookers were screaming and throwing rocks at him, which only startled Vijay, and he attacked Macaque and dragged him across the enclosure. Until soon, the zoo personnel were able to retrieve Macaque, but sadly, his injuries from the attack were too intense, and he died as a result. After some inspection, it was decided that Vijay would not be put down, as he had no known history of aggression towards people, and thankfully, since the attack, not only was he spared, but he sired several different litters of cubs. However, this goes to show that while zoos, for the most part, do a good job at keeping their animals in their enclosure, they need to do a better job at keeping the people out. Number 8. The African painted dog attack at the Pittsburgh Zoo. Like I said in the Vijay incident, zoos, for the most part, do a very good job with keeping the animals in their enclosures, but a lot of times they don't do a very good job at keeping the people coming to the zoo out of the enclosures. Such was the case in November of 2012 at the Pittsburgh Zoo. At the time, in November of 2012, a woman named Elizabeth Durkosh was at the zoo with her 2-year-old son, Maddox, and she lifted the boy up atop the railing of the viewing deck for a better look at the dogs. However, this is strictly a rule not to do that because it can be particularly dangerous for the kids. But Durkosh made her way past the warning signs when she lifted her son up. Maddox slipped from her grasp, bouncing off the safety net and on the ground of the enclosure several feet below. The wild dogs then proceeded to attack Maddox while Elizabeth screamed and tried to break into the enclosure to rescue her son. Shortly after, one of the dogs was gunned down by a police officer while the rest of the pack was able to flee. Later, Elizabeth filed a lawsuit against the zoo for the death of her son, and she was accused of criminal negligence in the court filing, but ultimately she won the case. The dogs were since moved to the Houston Zoo, and personally, I believe Elizabeth was really the one at fault because she shouldn't have been putting her child on top of the guardrails. If she really wanted to give her son a better view of the animals, she should have hoisted him on her shoulders. And given the circumstances of this case, I say that while a trip to the zoo might be a good day out for you and your family, don't bring your kids unless you're going to keep them in line. Number 7. Tilikum the Orca kills his trainer at SeaWorld Orlando. Now, the idea of keeping orcas in captivity for shows has been a very controversial subject because of incidents like Tilikum's. Tilikum was an adult male, 12,500 pound killer whale that lived at SeaWorld Orlando. He was captured at 2 years old along with 2 other young orcas in Iceland in November of 1983. He, along with the other orcas in the park, was used to perform tricks in shows for onlookers. However, on February 24th, 2010, Tilikum killed Don Brancho, one of his trainers. Brancho was killed following a Dine with Shamu show. The veteran trainer was rubbing Tilikum as part of a post-show routine when the orca grabbed her by her ponytail and pulled her into the water. Some witnesses reported seeing Tilikum grab Brancho by the arm or shoulder. He reportedly scalped her, then bit off her arm and swallowed it during the attack. Brancho's autopsy indicated death by drowning and blunt force trauma. Her death resulted in continuous legal case over the safety of working with orcas and the ethics of keeping live whales and other marine mammals in captivity. This incident, along with others involving captive killer whales, were the subject of the 2013 documentary Blackfish, which, in the film's perspective, explains why orcas shouldn't be kept in captivity. Number 6. Binky the polar bear at the Alaska Zoo. Binky was an adult male polar bear that lived at the Alaska Zoo in Anchorage after he first arrived there as an orphaned cub. As a fully grown bear, Binky weighed 1,200 pounds, and even before any attacks, he was a particularly aggressive bear since he bit off an employee's finger. His keeper commented, "Binky is stubborn and independent, and he likes to play games. When he's really feeling obstinate, he walks halfway into his den and sits down. He knows I can't close it. He is a very smart bear." But the most well-known incident involving Binky occurred on July 29th, 1994, when 29-year-old Australian tourist Catherine Warburton jumped over 2 safety rails to get an up-close photo of Binky in his enclosure. When Binky stuck his head through the bars and grabbed her, she suffered a broken leg and bite wounds. Another tourist caught the event on tape. Binky kept the woman's shoe for 3 days before it could be retrieved by zoo officials. Afterwards, Warburton gave the other shoe to the birdhouse, a bar in nearby Bird Creek that burned down in 1996. 6 weeks later, on September 11th, Binky was involved in yet another mauling. Drunken local teenagers approached the bear's enclosure, apparently hoping to swim in his pool, and one 19-year-old was hospitalized with leg lacerations after he was mauled. The zoo didn't confirm that Binky was the attacker, but the bear had blood on his face following the incident. After these attacks, Binky received international news coverage, and Binky merchandise was created, including t-shirts, mugs, and bumper stickers, often adorned with the shoe photo or with the slogan, "Send another tourist, this one got away." So while this incident is somewhat humorous, it should also remind us of the power and strength of the polar bear, which should be treated with great respect. Number 5. Tatiana the Tiger at the San Francisco Zoo. Now, unlike most of the attacks on the list, this one actually involved both an escape and an attack. Tatiana was an adult female Siberian tiger who lived at the San Francisco Zoo. While she did attack a zookeeper, I'm going to be focusing on her most infamous attack. On December 25th, 2007, shortly after closing time, 3 drunken men, including 17-year-old Carlos Eduardo Sousa Jr. and brothers Amritpal Paul Dhaliwal and Kulbir Dhaliwal, 19 and 23 years old respectively, were harassing Tatiana and throwing objects at her. After which, the tiger had escaped from her enclosure by leaping over the wall, and she attacked the three men. Sousa Jr. was killed, while the Dhaliwal brothers were injured. After the attack, the two brothers fled to the zoo cafe, which was locked. An employee heard their screams and called 911 at 5:07 p.m. The emergency response was delayed, first because the cafe employees said in their call that they suspected that the screaming person was mentally ill and that there was no actual animal attack, and later because zoo security guards were enforcing a lockdown to prevent Tatiana from escaping the zoo grounds. But after creating a distraction that got her away from the Dhaliwal brothers, Tatiana was gunned down by the police through a shot to her forehead. The Dhaliwal brothers received deep bites and claw wounds on their heads, necks, arms, and hands. Shortly after the incident, the zoo closed the tiger exhibit for a long time to have some renovations made to increase security, finally reopening the exhibit on February 16th, 2008. This proves to show that zoo animals are not playthings and should be treated with great respect. Number 4. Vince's death, the Twahi Zoo. Now, for the most part, endangered animals that live in zoos are protected from poachers. However, this time it was not the case. Vince was an adult male southern white rhino who lived at the Twahi Zoo in France along with two other rhinos named Bruno and Gracie. Vincent's life was mostly uneventful, but then, on March 5th, 2017, Vince's life came to a screeching halt because early in the morning, a gang of poachers broke into the zoo and headed straight for the rhino exhibit. They shot Vince 3 times in the head, killing him. Thankfully, though, Bruno and Gracie were able to escape, but the poachers then cut off Vince's front horn with a chainsaw, but then escaped. The only positive out of this incident is that the other 2 rhinos were unharmed. But still, this incident emphasizes the severity of rhino poaching because rhinos all over the world are being heavily poached for their horns, which are more valuable than gold on the black market. So while it is good that the other 2 rhinos survived, Vince's death shows that we must work harder to protect the world's rhinos from poachers. Number 3. Marius's death at the Copenhagen Zoo. Now, this incident should prove that not all zoos are great, because for those of you who don't know, Marius was a male giraffe who lived at the Copenhagen Zoo in Denmark. Just like with Vince, Marius's life was mostly uneventful, but his genes weren't proper for good breeding, and eventually the zoo ran out of space to keep him. Various zoos across Europe, such as the Krakow Zoo and the Yorkshire Wildlife Park, offered to take him, but the Copenhagen Zoo refused. On February 9th, 2014, Marius was killed by zoo staff with a bolt gun, and then he was dissected in front of a whole crowd of kids, and his remains were fed to the zoo's lions. The killing of Marius was criticized across Europe and the rest of the world. The Douai-la-Fontaine Zoo in France said that The event was shocking and wondered why a more soft solution had not been found. The Dublin Zoo in Ireland called it cold, calculated, cynical, and callous. And the director of the Krakow Zoo expressed deep disappointment. And even the Moscow Zoo in Russia condemned the actions. And I say, they're absolutely right. Incidents like this give zoos across the world a bad name and is part of the reason why many people have such negative opinions on zoos. So I think with Marius the giraffe's cruel death, it's safe to say that if I ever take a trip to Denmark, I will not be making a stop at the Copenhagen Zoo. Number 2. The Zanesville animal escape. Now, unlike all the other incidents, this did not occur at a public zoo, but rather at a private zoo. And for the record, while I love going to public zoos, I hate private zoos. They take no part in conservation, and the animals are often kept in small cages where they can barely move. This is yet another thing that makes people have a negative perspective on zoos. Such was the case here. In Zanesville, a man named Terry Thompson housed a large collection of exotic animals on his property. But he didn't really treat these animals very well, as the zoo had been repeatedly reported for poor housing conditions and insufficient food and water, and some of the animals had major infestations and inadequate repair to their cages. He was heavily in debt because of all the animals he kept, and he did time in jail for illegally selling guns. By the time he got out, Terry Thompson had found that his wife had left him, and so, as a result, he released 50 of the animals he owned before committing suicide. The 50 animals that he released were 18 tigers, 17 lions, 6 black bears, 2 grizzly bears, 3 cougars, 2 wolves, 1 baboon, and 1 macaque, all of which ended up being gunned down by the police. The only survivors of this incident were 3 leopards, 2 monkeys, and a grizzly bear, all of which were taken to the Columbus Zoo. And this is a real tragedy, and it's very heartbreaking to see. People often hear that Terry Thompson was an animal lover, but I know that is bogus because, one, if he really loved these animals, he never would have kept them on his property in the first place. 2, he wouldn't have kept them in such horrid conditions. And 3, he'd have never let them loose, despite knowing full well that they would be killed. And the number 1 worst zoo incident is Harambe's death at the Cincinnati Zoo. Ah, yes. How could I possibly forget this one? Now, for those of you who don't know, Harambe was a male western lowland gorilla who lived at the Cincinnati Zoo. He mostly lived a good life until that horrific tragedy occurred. For those of you living under a rock, on May 28th, 2016, just one day after Harambe's 17th birthday, a little boy said that he wanted to go into the gorilla enclosure, so he climbed through the fence, pushed through the bushes, but then fell 15 feet into the exhibit's moat. Zookeepers directed the other gorillas to go inside, and most of them did, with the exception of Harambe. Harambe went down into the moat and investigated the boy, and then started dragging him around. With no other alternative, zoo officials gunned down Harambe, and they closed their Gorilla World exhibit for a lengthy period of time for renovations to increase the security. As a result, Harambe became the subject of many memes, and after the renovations of Gorilla World were complete, a statue in Harambe's memory was dedicated. But all in all, this is yet another case of zoo exhibits failing to keep people out, but it's also the death of a critically endangered animal, which is why I consider Harambe's death the #1 worst zoo incident.
Well, that was it. My countdown list of the worst incidents that have occurred in zoos. Thanks for watching. Now I reiterate, in spite of this list, I'm still a very huge supporter of zoos, given that the fun times they give me and the contributions they've made to wildlife conservation. And I honestly pray that further incidents like these will be unlikely to happen again. But anyway, if you like this video, please subscribe if you haven't already. Alpha Lion Simba, out.